Hello everyone, my name is Jesus Valencia.
And I am Julian Gomez from Laboratorio Escénico, Universidad del Valle, Colombia.
And the title of our presentation is Theater's Pandemic, Evolving Practices, Adapting Strategies in the Global South. According to Judith Butler, this pandemic, quote, brings home the fact that we are implicated in a shared world, end quote. It also highlights several inequalities between regions and within countries. According to Richard Martinez, Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank, in Latin America and the Caribbean, quote, about 44 million people have fallen into poverty and 52 million people stopped belonging to the middle class and returned to the lower class in economic terms, end quote. In Colombia, COVID-19 was the primary cause of death in 2020, with over 50,000 fatalities by late December. Government restricted mobility based on gender identity and ID numbers to counter the virus spread. Unemployment rate edged up to 20% from April to June 2020. In Cali, the capital of Valle del Cauca department and the most populous city in southwest Colombia, the pandemic raised mental health problems by 125%. In an annual opinion poll, 45.2% thought that after 2020, quote, las cosas van por mal camino, end quote. Cali has been the destination for over 60,000 Venezuelan immigrants, most of them lacking economic resources. During April 2021, ICU occupancy rate reached 95%. In this city, the Department of Scenic Arts in Universidad del Valle, or UV, and Festival Brújula al Sur coped with the new normal to fulfill their artistic and educational purposes. These institutions faced governmental restrictions, economic upheavals, and migration to digital platforms. We explore how they survived the worst part of 2020 by adapting pedagogical strategies and evolving artistic practices. We use a qualitative approach to gather captcha through 40 in-person and virtual interviews conducted during the first 2 quarters of 2021 in Cali, Colombia. We looked for patterns for thematic analysis in our socio-phenomenological approach and deployed a theoretical framework to interpret the captcha in 4 clusters, borrowing from Jesus Valencia's IPCity, Bruno Latour's Actor Network Theory, or ANT, Jorge Dubati's Convivio and Tecnovivio, and Douglas C. North's concept of institutions as, quote, the underlying rules of the game, end quote. IPCity is a concept that understands identity as interaction rather than affiliation and offers a notion of agency as an interactive process. ANT helps us to trace phenomena in virtual and in-person networks of interaction. Convivio and Tecnovivio is Dubati's distinction between human-to-human and IT-mediated practices in terms of presence versus absence, territorializing versus deterritorializing, and experience versus information. An understanding of institutions as rules of the game allows us to look for shifting behavioral patterns, restructurings, and differences in outcomes. Thus, we focused our attention on how individuals and institutions interacted in real and virtual networks, how their interactions and identities shifted due to the pandemic, and how they adapted strategies and evolved practices. The group of interviewees included scholars, theater directors, actors, instructors, staff, and students of theater and dance. We divided the group into two subgroups: cultural industries and education. Interviews took place in Zoom and Meet and lasted 1 hour on average. Before the meetings, we sent prep questions to begin the reflection process. All interviewees shared a strong sense of resilience and a commitment to carry on and fulfill their pedagogical and artistic duties to heal a wounded society. Everybody agreed that video communication technologies do not offer a genuine theatrical experience. What was done in 2020 was not theater proper, but a mutation for adapting to the new normal. The first cluster shows that both subgroups experienced economic, mental, and emotional distress. Artists were heavily impacted economically due to lockdown and government restrictions. Many had to find alternative means of survival by shifting trades or resorting to family members and friends. On the other hand, the new normal disrupted education. Instructors and staff faced the fear of death because of their age group. The borders between public and private spheres were blurred when home became both schoolroom and workplace. Family dynamics and self-management habits shifted drastically. Instructors peeped into the students' family life, and students felt a lack of freedom and intimacy at home that hindered their artistic projects. They faced uncertainty, were ashamed of performing with family members around, experienced lack of self-control, and felt sometimes without direction in their education. The second cluster gave us insights into network dynamics and major social difficulties and changes. Resourcefulness was key in the transition from in-person to digital venues. The social isolation triggered social fear, lack of empathy and trust, and generalized frustration. Interviews relied on practices to improve their well-being, like opening spaces for self-knowledge and connecting within and with each other to create what one interviewee called, quote, an extended body of support, end quote. In Festival Brújula al Sur, there was involvement of IT professionals at all levels and a surge in online ticket sales beyond expectations, connecting with new audiences. The new normal promoted IT skills acquisition and highlighted the loss of the artistic commons during lockdown. Solidarity and togetherness were crucial to overcome personal despair. Lockdown and lack of government support were a deadly blow for the theater industry in Cali. In education, the students had a hard time with connectivity. They felt that acting classes diminished greatly in quality under the new conditions. There was involvement of families in classes and artistic projects out of need to minimize distractions. A conflict between discipline and empathy in academic processes emerged, with some professors demanding unrealistic expectations without taking into account the new normal. Some students left school due to financial constraints, opting for the military or working as webcam models. Administrative processes became a heavy burden. Lack of connectivity and IT expertise cramped the system. A culture of centralization and heavy bureaucracy hindered expedite decision-making. The third cluster revealed several tensions between in-person and IT-mediated practices at school and in professional venues. Platforms like Zoom or Meet were designed for business and information-oriented fields rather than artistic practices and experience-oriented endeavors. As an art form that relies on presence, theater was heavily affected by virtualization. It flattened the three-dimensional staging experience and transformed it into a two-dimensional screening process. When in-person shows were possible, audience members and artists had to follow strict biosecurity protocols that conditioned the venues. Festival Brújula al Sur invested heavily in IT infrastructure, which paid off well in online ticket sales. In education, investment in IT was insufficient to overcome the students' lack of resources. Screening shifted the quality of acting training. Acting students became peripheral, focusing only on facial gestures, voice, and two-dimensional composition, embracing a naturalistic style without elaborated theatricality. Their being a native digital generation helped them to master several IT skills. Nevertheless, when hybrid learning was possible and the students met their instructors, the best performers on the screen were not necessarily the best in person and vice versa, revealing how the medium determines good acting qualities. Also, Digital venues disrupted evaluation processes. It was impossible to have live meetings to showcase students' works due to connectivity problems. Recordings diminished spontaneity and moment-to-moment reaction, both crucial for training. In general, artists consider IT-mediated shows a mere register of true performance. However, there are some gains along the way, like meeting new audiences through site-specific theater, streaming and digital broadcasts, new artistic formats, more artistic innovation, screening as a creative option, new relations with the public, and an understanding of theater as an art that must move audiences beyond passivity. When government allowed for public meetings in late 2020, the re-encounter at the theater house made people aware of how much they missed this artistic ritual. The fourth cluster gave us a general impression on how the new rules of the game affected the subgroups and their institutions. Rescheduling was the norm in both school and festivals. In cultural industries, sales went down, budgets were cut, and there were insignificant subsidies for artists. In particular, Festival Brújula al Sur faced technical problems that require a great deal of flexibility. When in-person meetings became a possibility, biosecurity protocols were implemented, diminishing ticket sales. However, streaming services were made available and digital audiences abounded thanks to the leadership of Jorge Sabarain, the festival's artistic director, surpassing previous editions of the festival in total attendance. The sense of urgency and promptness in cultural industries contrasts with the slow pace of academia, where delays in planning, bureaucratic mandates, calendar changes, lack of IT skills, violence, and poverty hampered the transition to remote instruction. The new normal revealed huge financial inequality between faculty, adjuncts, and students, and a stark difference between the UV main campus in Cali and the UV Pacific campus in Buenaventura. There is a sense that UV has good policies, but lacks efficient faculty and staff members to implement them. Acting classes changed drastically. Spontaneity on the stage gave way to planning for the screen, with students preparing everything beforehand instead of relying on moment-to-moment impulses. However, script analysis improved, and the screening opened new aesthetic and dramatic possibilities. The pandemic also brought up many difficulties into students' lives that affected their education. There was food insecurity, lack of IT resources, connectivity, and a surge in domestic violence. Several students had to find a job to help their families to make ends meet. UV rolled out several financial and technical aid programs, but the lack of expertise dealing with its heavy bureaucracy in virtual settings slowed down execution. Remote instruction proved to be less democratic than in-person classes. Students' lack of IT resources, financial stability, and proper locations diminished an already impoverished educational experience. Theater as a physical commons was lost. Several interviews agree that IT-mediated shows are not theater proper, but a mutation that lacks presence. However, digital connectivity raised attendance in Festival Brújula al Sur precisely because technology deterritorialized the experience. Nonetheless, the forced migration to digital platforms unmasked the weaknesses of institutions and leaders. There is widespread Zoom fatigue without anyone signaling its implications, a huge work overload due to an intricate and inefficient bureaucracy, a blurring of public and private spaces, an outstanding incapacity to deal with contingencies in virtuality, a severe lack of institutional independence, and an erasure of many commons because virtuality personalized access to information and processes in an extremely unequal country. In the new normal, an analog economy had to become digital all of a sudden, but platforms like Zoom and Meet were not suitable for theater practice or acting training. A whole generation of performers will not experience what is to grow up on a stage. Nevertheless, it would have been impossible to keep our practice alive without these IT tools. The fusion of technology and performance brought transhuman practices to the forefront of our artistic endeavors and saved us from despair. Despite government efforts to bolster self-sufficient cultural industries through Economía Naranja, the pandemic revealed their financial dependence on the state, with most of them affected by budget cuts in culture and arts. In-person artistic projects came to an end, but digital meetings allowed for international collaborations and IT qualification. For instance, Festival Brújula al Sur had its highest attendance in history. Institutionally, UV could not supply the needs of an impoverished student body. There was not a contingency plan or a clear path, and students and instructors were on their own. A survey in June 2020 showed that 30% of the student body in our BFA program in acting lacked connectivity. To this date, aid has not arrived yet due to civil unrest caused by massive protests throughout the country. There is a general feeling that government officials were ineffective during the pandemic. The rate of turnover among ministers in Iván Duque's cabinet was 66%. Nepotism and cronyism have been pervasive in Colombian history. Meritocracy is almost absent. Social inequality correlates with colonial racial patterns, which suggests structural problems and a disregard for facing a history of discrimination. Centralism slows down decision-making and promotes inefficiency and corruption. Lack of executive leadership and abrupt shifts in government have been the norm. By late April 2021, the Department of Scenic Arts at UV was spearheading a transition from remote instruction to hybrid learning, following strict biosecurity measures. But the eruption of social unrest on April 28 halted all the processes. Students declared General Assembly and classes were suspended. Dozens of them led the way on the protests in the streets. Government withdrew a controversial tax reform that affected everything, and the final minister quit it. However, activists used the momentum to push for civil rights. The official answer was violence. 3,789 instances of police brutality and 78 civilians killed. Several of our students in Cali suffered police brutality and one was stabbed by a paramilitary group. In Buenaventura, a group of students was kidnapped by organized crime and tortured in a warehouse until the community paid the ransom. The police and right-wing militias attacked students, workers, native Colombians, and other groups of protesters. Vandalism abounded, and Cali was militarized on May 28. Colombian bureaucracy is so cumbersome that contingencies are everywhere, but dealing with them in virtuality proved to be extremely difficult, slowing down already sluggish institutional environments. Mental health issues were and are pervasive. People face the threat of death and revalued family, friends, and theater. Rules and norms changed at home, destroying the borders between public and private spheres. Not only artistic convivio shifted to technovivio in cultural industries and education, but everything became technovivio in the new normal, limiting human interactions at a scale without precedent in human history. Ritual in theater was lost, but important resources came from IT-related fields. IT was crucial for networking during lockdown, keeping education and theater alive, and later, in the middle of government repression, was key to decentralize information, plan tactics of civil disobedience, and unite people against unjust authority. Right now, Colombian society is in a showdown between the politics of repression and the politics of dialogue, individualism and solidarity, empathy and mercilessness. There is a clear need to decentralize processes, streamline a quasi-colonial bureaucracy, foster nurturing environments, and push for civil rights. Civil society revealed its weaknesses in a country in which the government is not only a referee, but a player in the market and everything else, allowing for corruption, crony capitalism, and even brutal repression. Structural changes are urgently needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.